end for the trapper, a man of buckskin and solitude whose name the forest had already forgotten, came not with a cacophony of bestial rage, but with a silence so profound it was a physical weight. For 2 days he had pushed homeward, his pack weighing a good 60 pounds with pelts, the crisp 45-degree autumn air a familiar balm to his sun-weathered face. He had been skirting the tenebrous eaves of the twilight forest for a dozen miles, that ancient and brooding expanse of northern wilderness that sane folk avoided. As the sun bled its last anemic light below the jagged horizon, the familiar chorus of the wilderness, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of unseen things, the distant call of a night bird, died. It did not fade. It was extinguished, as though a great suffocating hand had been clapped over the mouth of the world. The air grew still and cold, heavy with the loamy scent of decay and something else, something acrid and primal. He paused, his own breath a plume of white vapor in the gloom, his hand tightening on the worn stock of his rifle. It was not the presence of a predator he felt, but the absence of all else. The very woods were holding their breath. Then came the sound, a single heavy snap of a branch a good 6 inches in diameter, too thick for any common deer or bear. It was followed by a sound of immense bellows breathing, a slow, deep, rhythmic respiration that emanated from the shadows themselves. He turned, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, and saw it. A silhouette, vast and impossible, detached itself from the deeper blackness between 2 monolithic pines. It was a thing of hulking shoulders and a low-slung head. But what froze the marrow in his bones were the eyes, 2 burning embers of baleful amber, lit from within by a cold, intelligent fire. They were not the eyes of a beast. They were the eyes of a devil. The shadow surged forward with a speed that defied its bulk. The trapper's scream, a thin, reedy note of pure, unadulterated terror, was a brief punctuation mark in the crushing silence before it was abruptly choked off. 2 days later, I arrived. I moved through the gloaming with a silence born of my elven lineage, a pale wraith against the dark, practical leathers that encased my form. The scene of the slaughter was a place of profound violation. The ground was churned and scored, the air still thick with the coppery tang of spilled life, a scent that whispered and coiled in the back of my throat, a serpent of insatiable thirst. I knelt, my senses a curse and a tool, sifting through the grim tableau with the cold precision of a mortician. The tracks were immense, the claws that had made them having sunk inches into the hard-packed earth and splintered the exposed roots of a great oak. They spoke of a creature whose weight must have topped 1/2 a ton, a leviathan of fang and fury. But it was not the tracks that held my attention. It was the ash. Scattered in a strange, ritualistic pattern around the most grievously desecrated remains of the trapper was a fine, gray powder. I gathered a pinch between my fingers. It was cool to the touch, yet it carried a phantom heat, and the scent was an abomination. It was the smell of burnt earth, of ozone after a lightning strike, and of magic, raw and corrupted, that had been violently torn from the very fabric of the land. This was no mere animal. This was a sorcerer in a beast's skin. The metallic perfume of the victim's blood was a symphony of damnation to my senses. A sharp, debilitating ache bloomed behind my eyes, and I felt the hated lengthening of my canines against my lower lip. The hunger, the endless, gnawing parasite that lived in my veins, stirred from its slumber. It was a physical torment, a clawing need that strained to overwhelm the last vestiges of the person I once was. With a hand that trembled not from fear but from a desperate, focused will, I drew the silver dagger from my belt. The hilt was worn smooth from countless repetitions of this grim sacrament. I did not hesitate. I drove the blade deep into the flesh of my left palm. The pain was a clean white fire, a bolt of purifying agony that seared through the rising tide of my vampiric nature. The hunger receded, snarling back into its cage of flesh and bone, cowed by the searing kiss of the silver. I held my bleeding hand, the mingling of my own lifeblood with the cold metal a stark reminder of the war that raged eternally within me. This self-inflicted torture was my anchor, the ritual that kept the monster caged. With the inner demon momentarily silenced, I rose and followed the faint trail deeper into the twilight forest. To call it a forest was to do it a disservice. It was a living entity, ancient and sentient, and it knew I was an intruder. My elven senses, usually a comfort in the wild, were here a source of torment. They picked up not just the mundane, the scent of damp moss, the far-off trickle of water perhaps half a mile distant, but the palpable aura of hostility that radiated from the very soil. The gnarled ancient trees leaned in as I passed, their branches like skeletal fingers that snagged at my cloak. The wind that sighed through their boughs was no simple movement of air. It carried whispers, distorted and sibilant, fragments of a language older than man, older than elf. That night, I made no fire. I required no sleep, only the cold, still trance of meditation to shore up my defenses. As I sat in the oppressive dark, a new assault began. It was a howl, yet it did not strike the ears. It was a phantom chorus that bypassed the senses entirely and tore directly at the fragile architecture of my consciousness. It was a wave of pure, weaponized despair, a psychic shriek designed to shatter the will and induce gibbering panic. My control frayed, my carefully constructed mental walls cracking under the onslaught. I clung to the elven mantras of my youth, their syllables a lifeline in a sea of madness. I weathered the storm, but it left me psychically scourged, trembling and drained, with a new and profound fear of the foe I hunted. The next morning, haggard and worn, I came upon a stream. Beside it lay another victim, this one a magnificent stag, its body rent asunder with the same shocking violence as the trapper's. But there, nestled amongst the blood-matted fur and gore, was something else. A small primitive artifact, a totem, crudely fashioned from a shard of bone no more than 4 inches long and adorned with the black feathers of a crow. A faint, sickly magic pulsed from it, a rhythmic thrum that resonated with the lingering scent of burnt sorcery I had found before. My mind, reeling, pieced together the dreadful truth. This was not the chaotic savagery of a rampaging beast. This was a ritual. The killings were sacrifices. As I reached down and my fingers closed around the bone totem, a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision sent a jolt of ice through my veins. It was a swift, low-slung shadow, a blur of darkness that darted between the trunks of the ancient trees and vanished. It had been there for some time. I knew it with a sickening certainty. I was being watched. The hunt had begun, but the roles of hunter and hunted had become terrifyingly, irrevocably blurred. Logic, that cold and dispassionate compass, dictated my next move. Information was paramount, and the only repository of local lore and fear was the nearest human settlement, a miserable collection of wattle and daub hovels huddled by a sluggish, reed-choked creek no more than 20 feet across. The place bore no formal name on any map I knew, but its atmosphere was one of a community that had long since given up and was merely waiting for the end. It was a hamlet perched on the very lip of the abyss. As I approached, a palpable miasma of terror drifted out to meet me. The streets, little more than muddy tracks, were deserted. Heavy wooden shutters were bolted over every window. Crude wards and symbols of forgotten rustic gods scrawled upon them in chalk. The few faces I glimpsed through cracks in the doors were pale and haunted, their eyes wide with a superstitious dread that deepened as they fell upon me, a stranger clad in darkness, moving with an unnatural silence. They saw no savior, only another shade of the encroaching night. In the village's only tavern, a squalid, smoky room that stank of sour ale and unwashed bodies, I found the first flicker of resistance. Her name was Lena, a young woman with the calloused hands of a herbalist and the defiant fire of grief in her eyes. She tended to the patrons, a collection of broken men who drank to forget the sounds from the forest, with a grim efficiency. While others shrank from my presence, she met my gaze directly. I learned, through terse and clipped exchanges, that her younger brother had vanished a week prior, swallowed by the same darkness that had taken the trapper. In her, the suffocating blanket of fear was shot through with the hot, sharp needle of anger. She was the only one willing to speak, driven not by courage, but by the desperate, pragmatic hope that I, this pale and predatory stranger, was the instrument of her vengeance. I questioned her, my voice low and even, a counterpoint to the simmering terror in the room. She spoke of the blood moon, a celestial phenomenon, an eclipse that stained the lunar face a ghastly shade of crimson and occurred only once every few years. The attacks, she confirmed, had begun with its recent arrival. She also spoke of the victims, not just her brother, but others from neighboring farmsteads who had been taken. They were not the weak, the old, or the infirm. They were, without exception, the strongest and healthiest of the young men, the pride of their families. A pattern emerged from the chaos, a chilling logic to the slaughter. This was not random predation, this was a harvest. I produced the totem I had found by the slain deer. Its crude form absorbed the flickering candlelight, casting a pall over our table. Lena drew in a sharp breath. She recognized the symbols etched into the bone. They were not the jagged, chaotic markings of some beast cult. They were runes, ancient and terrestrial, tied to the deep magic of the earth itself. She told me of an old hermit, a recluse who had lived deep within the woods years ago, a man known to be a practitioner of such old ways. He, too, had vanished without a trace, long before the current troubles. The mystery deepened, another tangled knot in a cord that was slowly tightening around my neck. That night, the forest's malevolence spilled into the hamlet. It was not the Alpha, the great shadow I sought, but one of its lesser spawn, an Omega, a scout driven by a desperate, reckless hunger. It came for the livestock, a frantic blur of fur and fang in the moonlight. Panic, shrill and infectious, erupted through the village. Men spilled from their homes, brandishing rusty pitchforks and sputtering torches, their makeshift weapons pitifully inadequate against the creature's preternatural speed and strength. It moved like a living shadow, a whirlwind of claws that sent splinters flying from the wooden pens. I could not stand idly by. To reveal my nature was a risk, but to allow the slaughter to continue was an offense to the cold order I sought to impose. I intervened. I did not unleash the full horrific arsenal of my vampiric might, for to do so would be to trade one monster for another in the eyes of these simple people. Instead, I relied on the ghost of my elven heritage. I moved with a fluid grace that was utterly inhuman, a dancer in a charnel house. My silver dagger became a flicker of light, deflecting, parrying, and finally finding its mark. I did not kill the creature. I wounded it, a deep gash in its flank that sent it howling back into the suffocating darkness from whence it came. I had saved them, but I had not earned their gratitude. I had earned their fear. They stared at me now with a new terror, one born not of a beast they could not understand, but of a man who moved in ways no man should. They saw the monster in my grace. As the villagers retreated to the false security of their homes, Lena approached me. Her face was pale in the moonlight, but her eyes were steady. She had seen what I could do. She implored me, her voice a low, urgent whisper, to hunt down the creatures, to end them. In exchange, she offered the only currency she possessed, her knowledge. She knew the forest's secret ways, the hidden trails, the herbs that could mask a scent from a predator's nose or draw the poison from a wound. I, who had walked alone for centuries, bristled at the thought of an ally, a companion. Yet, her offer was a practical one, and the path ahead was shrouded in a darkness I could not navigate by my senses alone. With a reluctance that felt like a physical weight, I agreed. I had found a guide, a temporary and fragile alliance forged in blood and terror. The wounded wolf was my key. Its pain and fury would make it predictable, its blood trail a scarlet thread leading me deeper into the labyrinth of this conspiracy. My plan was not to kill, but to capture and interrogate, to rip the secrets from its dying mind. Guided by Lena's whispered directions, I found a narrow gorge, a wound in the earth where the granite bones of the world were laid bare. Here I set my trap. I spent hours preparing, my movements precise and economical. I coated the tips of several silver-headed arrows with a potent neurotoxin of my own devising, a concoction of nightshade and other, less natural things, designed not to slay but to paralyze, to turn a raging predator into a helpless prisoner. With vines as strong as iron cables, I wove snares, concealing them with a cunning layer of leaves and detritus. The gorge would become a cage. For bait, I offered the one thing I knew the creature could not resist, the one thing that was both my greatest weapon and my most profound curse, my own blood. I drew the silver dagger, its familiar coldness a grim comfort, and made a shallow incision along my forearm. The scent that blossomed on the air was intoxicating even to me, a dark and vital perfume that promised power and satiety. It was a calculated risk, a deliberate flirtation with the very demon I sought to suppress. The hunger stirred within me, a low, insistent hum beneath the surface of my skin, but I forced it down. The need for information was greater than the need to feed. The scent, carried on the night wind, was a summons. It did not take long. A crashing in the undergrowth, a guttural snarl of mingled rage and pain, and then it was there, bursting into the moonlit gorge. It was a young one, as I had suspected, its fur matted with dried blood from our previous encounter, its eyes burning with a rabid fire. The fight was a brutal ballet. The werewolf was a storm of raw power, its claws gouging deep furrows in the ancient stone, its jaws snapping with the force of a bear trap. I was the wind, a fleeting shadow that it could not touch, I used the terrain to my advantage, leaping from boulder to boulder, keeping the beast at a distance, a phantom always just beyond the reach of its devastating attacks. My own strikes were swift and surgical, my dagger a silver needle seeking out the vulnerable points in its anatomy, the tendons in its legs, the muscles of its shoulders. But in my focus, I misjudged. The beast, in a paroxysm of fury, swiped not at me but at the ground beneath my feet, shattering the rock and sending me sprawling. For a heartbeat, the world spun. Before I could recover, a massive clawed paw descended. I threw up my forearm in a desperate instinctual block. The claws, 3 inches long and thick as daggers, tore through my hardened leather bracer as if it were parchment. I felt a blinding, sickening agony as they ripped through flesh and muscle, scraping against the bone with a sound that vibrated through my entire skeleton. The pain was a white-hot nova, pulling me down toward the welcome oblivion of unconsciousness. On that precipice of defeat, with the beast's hot, fetid breath on my face, something within me broke. The carefully constructed dam of my self-control shattered, and the darkness flooded in. My eyes, I know, bled from their usual pallid gray to a burning, venomous crimson. The forbidden art, the blood magic I so despised, answered my silent, desperate call. From the wound in my arm, my own lifeblood did not merely drip. It writhed. Tendrils of viscous, semi-sentient crimson erupted from the gash, whipping through the air like living serpents. They wrapped around the werewolf's limbs and torso, constricting with supernatural force, pulling it from me and pinning it against the rock wall. Then, driven by a despair beyond reason, I unleashed the most profane of my abilities. I reached out with my mind and my will, and I began to drain it. It was not a clean process. It was a violent psychic siphoning, a plundering of its life force, its memories, its very essence. As the creature's struggles ceased and its life faded, its consciousness flooded into mine. I was assaulted by a chaotic torrent of images, not of mindless rage, but of something far more complex and terrifying. I saw the blood moon hanging like a raw wound above a great cyclopean stone that pulsed with a faint, internal light, a structure that resembled a sacrificial altar. I saw the face of the Alpha, Ulfgar, but it was not contorted in fury. It was a mask of profound, ancient sorrow, and most disquieting of all, I felt the dying beast's own emotions. Not bloodlust, but a powerful, overwhelming sense of duty, of a desperate need to protect something sacred and vital. The truth, I realized with a dawning horror, was not the simple black-and-white affair I had imagined. I had won the physical battle, but the victory was hollow, leaving me feeling defiled, tainted by the raw, feral essence I had absorbed. The alien fury I had consumed now fed my own vampiric nature, making it stronger, more insistent. The grievous wound on my arm was already beginning to seal itself with an unnatural speed, knitting flesh and sinew together. But I knew it would leave a hideous puckered scar, a permanent brand that would pulse with a faint, dark light, a testament to the price of my victory. I was more powerful, yes, but I had taken a significant, irreversible step toward becoming the very thing I hunted. The death of the young wolf did not go unnoticed. It was a stone cast into a still black pool, and the ripples spread with alarming speed. Ulfgar, the Alpha, the guardian of this cursed wood, felt the severing of the bond, the snuffing out of one of his own. The forest, an extension of his will, ceased its passive observation and began its counterattack. My destruction became its sole, driving purpose. The psychological war that had begun with the phantom howl now escalated into a full-scale assault on the foundations of my sanity. The very landscape began to writhe and twist around me. Paths that had been straight now coiled back upon themselves like serpents. Trees, ancient and unmoving for centuries, shifted their positions when my gaze was averted, forming impenetrable thickets where moments before there had been clearings. The geography of the woods had become a fluid, malevolent thing, a physical manifestation of a hostile intellect. This spatial distortion was soon joined by a more insidious torment. My own past, a crypt I kept sealed with discipline and ritual, was pried open. I began to hear whispers on the wind, not in the sibilant tongue of the forest, but in the elegant, cruel, elven speech of the elders who had cast me out, their voices dripping with contempt for my tainted blood. Then came the guttural curses of the pure-blooded vampires who had sired me, who had despised me for the elven grace that diluted my predatory perfection. The forest became a stage, and upon it, my greatest fears and failures were reenacted by phantoms of mist and shadow. I saw illusions of alternate lives, a proud elven lore master, a powerful vampiric lord, specters mocking the reality of my pathetic hybrid existence. But the most harrowing of these visions were the silent ones. The forest conjured the wraiths of those whose lives I had taken to sustain my own unnatural existence. Not just the beasts of the field, but the men, bandits, soldiers, lonely travelers, upon whom I had fed in centuries past. They did not speak. They did not threaten. They simply stood at the periphery of my vision, their eyes hollow and accusatory, their spectral forms a silent, ever-present jury. The physical threats grew more cunning. The roots of the great oaks, thick as a man's thigh, stirred as I passed, attempting to snake around my ankles and drag me down. From the stagnant, black-watered fens that dotted the forest floor, cloying, sweet-smelling vapors rose, inducing a profound vertigo and a sickening nausea that made each step a trial of will. I was forced to move at a crawl, my senses stretched to their breaking point, testing every foot of ground before trusting it with my weight. To continue was madness. To stop was to be consumed. Trapped in this waking nightmare, I realized my conventional senses were a liability. They were the very gates through which the poison was being poured. I found a small defensible hollow at the base of a granite outcrop, and forced myself into a state of profound meditation. I sealed off my sight, plunging myself into a willed blindness. I blocked my hearing, shutting out the chorus of accusation and deceit. I turned inward, relying solely on that latent, non-physical perception that was my elven birthright, the ability to feel the flow and texture of magic itself. In that silent, sightless state, the world resolved into a new and terrible clarity. I could not see the trees, but I perceived the steady, life-giving flow of magic through them. The illusions, which had been so convincing to my eyes and ears, now appeared as they truly were, ugly, discordant knots in the natural tapestry of the forest's aura. They were tumors of psychic energy, festering and wrong. And by tracing these threads of corrupt magic back to their source, I found it. I began to see a pattern, a web of power spread across this section of the forest. The source of the hallucinatory storm was not Ulfgar himself, but a network of relays, a circle of those same crude bone and feather totems planted in the earth, each one pulsing with a malevolent energy, amplifying and focusing the alpha's will into this psychic onslaught. I rose from my trance, my purpose clear. I moved through the phantasmagoria, which now seemed thin and theatrical. A ghost of myself, whole, healed, happy, stepped into my path, its face a mask of beatific peace, begging me to lay down my arms and accept the forest's embrace. I strode through it as if it were smoke. One by one, I found the totems and smashed them with the pommel of my silver dagger. With each one that shattered, a psychic scream echoed in the non-space of my mind, and the illusion around me weakened. When the last one crumbled to dust, the magical storm broke. The forest was once again just a forest, dark, menacing, but no longer actively trying to unmake my mind. I stood, panting, exhausted to the very core of my being. But I had survived, and more I had learned. Ulfgar was not merely a beast of superlative strength. He was a shaman of terrifying power. The hunt had escalated to a battle of wills, a war of sorcery. By destroying the nexus of totems, I had silenced the psychic assault, but in doing so, I had lit a beacon in the darkness. I had revealed my precise location to the master of this domain. The oppressive, hallucinatory silence was replaced by something far more primal and immediate. The sound of the hunt. A single, long, mournful howl rose to the west, and it was answered by another from the east, then another from the north. The calls were not random. They were signals, a tightening net of lupine predators closing in. Ulfgar had tired of his games of the mind. Now, he had unleashed his pack. The full, coordinated hunt had begun. What followed was a terrifying display of predatory intelligence. This was not a mindless mob of snarling beasts. This was a disciplined military operation. They did not charge me head-on. They harried me, drove me like wolves culling a stag from its herd. Shadows flickered on my flanks, their movements swift and economical, always just out of sight. Others, I sensed, were racing ahead, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to cut off my paths of retreat, to channel me toward dead ends and killing grounds. They were masters of their environment, turning the forest itself into a weapon against me. They drove me from the high ground, forcing me down into the sucking mire of the swamplands, then up again toward the treacherous scree-covered slopes of a rocky bluff. They were testing my endurance, bleeding my strength, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came at a river crossing. The water was swift and cold, the banks steep and slick with mud. It was a natural bottleneck, an ideal place for an ambush. As I reached the middle of the churning current, they attacked. Two of them, both massive specimens, exploded from the dense thickets on either side of the river. They hit the water simultaneously, their charge sending up great plumes of spray. The fight was a desperate, thrashing affair in the freezing water. There was no room for elven grace, only for brutal close-quarters combat. My dagger found the throat of one, but as it fell, the other lunged, its claws tearing through my tunic and into the flesh of my side, a deep, ragged gouge that sent a fresh wave of agony through me. In that moment of searing pain, I saw a flicker of movement on the far bank. Lena, her face a pale oval of horror in the gloom. She had followed me, and she had now witnessed the full, terrible extent of my power as I was forced to use a minor blood curse to blast the remaining beast backward, giving me the second I needed to escape. Wounded, bleeding, and with the howls of the pack closing in again, I scrambled up the far bank and fled. The pain in my side was a hot iron, and a crimson trail marked my passage. I was losing strength, my vision starting to swim. Just as I felt my legs begin to fail, a hand grabbed my arm. It was Lena, her fear overcome by a desperate resolve. She did not speak, merely pulled me along, her knowledge of the terrain now my only salvation. She led me through a dense stand of pines, behind a curtain of falling water I would never have noticed, and into a hidden cave. The roar of the waterfall was a deafening curtain of sound, masking our scent and our presence from the hunters outside. Inside the small, damp cavern, I collapsed. I was on the verge of losing consciousness, my lifeblood pooling on the cold stone floor. In that moment, I was utterly vulnerable, a broken thing at the mercy of a human I barely knew. She worked quickly, her hands surprisingly steady as she packed the wound in my side with pungent herbs and bound it with strips of cloth torn from her own clothing. There, in the flickering light of the small lantern she carried, we spoke. It was not a conversation of allies, but the tense, strained exchange of two beings from different worlds, bound by a shared enemy. Looking at her, I saw not merely a helper, but a painful echo of the simple mortal life that I had been denied, a world of warmth and connection I could never inhabit. As she tended to my wounds, Lena told me something that shifted the very ground beneath my feet. Her brother, she confessed, had not simply vanished. In the days before he was taken, he had been acting strangely. He spoke of a voice from the forest that was calling to him, of a belief that the curse could be turned back. A dreadful new truth took root in my mind, a possibility so outlandish I had not considered it. The pack was not merely killing its victims. They were not thinning the human herd. They were recruiting. The stolen men were not dead. They were changed. My entire quest had been predicated on a simple premise: to hunt and destroy a monster. Now I saw that I was facing something far more complex. I could not defeat the entire pack in open combat. I had just received a bloody lesson in that reality. A new plan began to form, born of desperation and this terrifying new insight. I had to stop hunting the beast, and instead find its heart. I had to find their lair while the Alpha and his hunters were still scouring the forest for me. My objective had changed from a simple assassination to a far more dangerous infiltration. I had to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Our journey was a thing of shadows and silence. Lena, now my unwilling Virgil in this sylvan hell, guided us along ancient, forgotten game trails and dry creek beds, paths that did not exist on any map. Her knowledge was our shield, allowing us to slip through the tightening net of the werewolf patrols. The howls still echoed through the trees, but they grew more distant as we pressed deeper into the forest's heart, toward the brooding mass of a half-ruined mountain known to the locals as the Spine of Sorrow. The entrance to the lair was not a simple cave mouth. It was a masterpiece of concealment, both natural and arcane. At the base of a sheer cliff face, a gargantuan fissure was hidden behind a living curtain of gnarled, interwoven roots, thick as pythons. A subtle, shimmering illusion was layered over it, a glamour that made the casual observer's eye slide right past. Having been schooled in the Alpha's sorcerous tricks, I felt the wrongness of the air, the subtle distortion in the weave of magic. I reached out a hand, and my fingers passed through the illusion as if through mist, into the cold, damp darkness beyond. The interior was not the noisome, bone-strewn den of beasts I had expected. It was a vast and complex network of natural caverns, smoothed by time and water, extending deep into the mountain's core. The air was warm and smelled of earth, fir, and wood smoke, and it was inhabited. We moved through the shadows of the great central caverns, and what I saw struck at the very foundations of my grim purpose. There were people here, women tending to cook fires, old men carving tools from wood and bone, and in a secluded alcove, a nursery of sorts where pups, half human and half wolf, tumbled and played under the watchful eyes of their mothers. They were not monsters. They were a tribe, a clan, a people living a life of harsh, primitive isolation. The scenes of simple, domestic existence of community and kinship were a jarring dissonance against the backdrop of the brutal killings I had investigated. My black and white world of hunter and hunted was dissolving into shades of an unbearable, incomprehensible gray. Hiding in the deep shadows behind a pillar of rock, we became privy to a conversation that would unravel everything. Two of the great werewolves, the betas who were clearly Ulfgar's lieutenants, were speaking in low, guttural tones. They were in their human forms powerful men etched with scars and the wisdom of years. From their hushed, urgent words, I gleaned a truth so shocking it stole the breath from my lungs. The curse of the blood moon was not a curse at all, but a vital, sacred ritual. It was a time of cleansing, a painful but necessary process to keep the more savage, untamed aspects of their nature in check, to maintain the balance between man and beast. The attacks on the human settlements were not random acts of terror. They were a selective culling, an ingathering. They were taking only those humans in whom a trace of the old blood still ran, descendants of the ancient, wild tribes of the north. They were not killing them. They were rescuing them from the slow decay of the modern world, offering them a chance to reawaken their true nature. And the source? The font of power I had sought as my own personal salvation. It was real. But its function was not what the legends claimed. It did not heal. It did not cure. It burned away any magic it deemed unnatural, any power not of the earth itself. For a creature like me, a hybrid abomination of elven and vampiric sorcery, it would mean not a cleansing, but an agonizing dissolution, a complete unmaking of body and soul. For the werewolves, it was a sacred place of power, the very heart of their existence, and they were sworn to protect it at all costs. In a deeper, torch-lit chamber we found him, Lena's brother. He was alive, seated on a stone bench, his eyes wide and unfocused, caught in a deep, placid trance. Beside him, in his human form, sat Ulfgar. He was a man of immense physical presence, his hair a mane of silver, his face a road map of ancient scars. But his eyes held no malice. They were weary, ancient, and filled with a profound wisdom. He was holding the boy's hand, speaking to him in a low, calming monotone, speaking of coming home, of shedding the shell of the new world. He was not tormenting the boy. He was guiding him through a metamorphosis. The sight was too much for Lena. A choked, desperate cry, her brother's name, escaped her lips. The sound cut through the cavern's stillness like a shard of glass. We were discovered. Ulfgar's head snapped up, his ancient eyes locking onto mine. There was no rage in his gaze, only a deep, bottomless well of sorrow and disappointment. The two betas were on their feet in an instant, their forms beginning to twist and elongate. The alarm was raised. A chase began, a desperate flight through the narrow, winding tunnels of the lair. To give Lena a chance to escape with her brother, whom she managed to shake from his trance into a state of terrified confusion, I made a stand. I turned to face the two pursuing betas in a narrow passage, unleashing a wave of blood kinesis to bring the ceiling crashing down behind me, sealing us in. The fight was short and savage. I dispatched them both, but not before their claws left fresh, deep wounds across my chest and shoulders. I had won, but I was now trapped, wounded and alone, deep in the heart of my enemy's sanctum. My victory was a brief, bloody affair that left me cornered and exhausted. The sound of the rockfall brought not silence, but the steady, unhurried approach of the Alpha himself. There was no escape. They took me, not with the savagery I expected, but with a kind of grim reverence. My weapons were removed, my wounds crudely but effectively bound, and I was led, a prisoner, into the central chamber of the lair. It was a vast cathedral-like cavern. The walls were covered in immense, intricate carvings that snaked from floor to a ceiling 50 feet high. A sprawling, pictographic history of a people, chronicling their bond with the forest, their wars, and their long, lonely vigil. Ulfgar was waiting for me there, seated on a stone throne, once again in his human form. He gestured for me to be brought before him, and to my astonishment, he addressed me not as a monster or an invader, but as a peer. His voice was a low, resonant rumble filled with the weight of ages. He told me his story, the truth of his people. They were not cursed men. They were a species unto themselves, an ancient race of guardians, intrinsically bound to the life force of the twilight forest. Their sworn sacred duty was to protect the source, for it was more than a font of power. It was a lock, a seal on a prison containing a far older, far more terrible entity, a thing of primordial chaos that slumbered in the molten heart of the world. The source, he explained, was a concentration of raw, untamed, telluric energy. It did not possess the sentience to heal or cure. It was a pure, chaotic force that simply zeroed out any complex magical structure it touched. It reduced things to their base components. For a werewolf, whose magic was of the earth, it was a place of renewal. For me, a creature whose very existence was a profane knot of two opposing and unnatural magics, contact would not bring healing. It would trigger a catastrophic war between my elven and vampiric halves, a conflict that would tear me apart on a molecular level. It would be a death of unimaginable agony, an utter and complete dissolution. The legend of its healing properties, he revealed, was a lie, a piece of cruel propaganda created by a vampire coven centuries ago as a convenient and permanent way to dispose of their impure or inconvenient offspring. Then he turned his ancient gaze upon me, and the conversation became deeply, horribly personal. He knew of me, not of my name, but of my creation. He spoke of the elven mages who, in their arrogance, had dabbled in the forbidden arts of vampirism. They were not seeking immortality, he explained. They were attempting to forge a perfect weapon, a being with the grace and natural attunement of an elf, fused with the unholy strength and resilience of a vampire, to be used in a forgotten war against a rival bloodline. I was not a mistake of nature. I was a product of malice, an engineered assassin. My all-consuming quest for a cure, the very core of my identity, was not my own desire. It was a fail-safe, a final command programmed into my very being by my creators. Should their weapon prove uncontrollable, it would be driven by an artificial compulsion to seek out the one thing in the world that could utterly destroy it. My hope was a lie. My life's purpose was a self-destruct sequence. The weight of his words was a physical blow. The entire edifice of my long, miserable existence crumbled to dust in that moment. My hatred of myself, my quest for purity, my elven meditations, my vampiric shame, all of it was a script written by others. I was a puppet, and I had never even seen the strings. Ulfgar watched the collapse of my world play out on my face, his own expression one of grim pity. He then made his offer. He would not hold me. I was free to leave the forest and never return, to live with the crushing weight of this new truth. Or I could follow my programming. I could meet him at the source on the night of the blood moon, which was now only a day away, and play out the final fatal scene of the drama my creators had written for me. He warned me, however, that to do so, to engage him in combat at the source, would not only ensure my own destruction, but would also risk weakening the seal that held the ancient evil in its cage. My personal tragedy could become a global catastrophe. He gave the order, and his wolves stood aside, opening a path for me to the outside world. "Go, child of two worlds," he said, his voice echoing in the vast cavern. "Your choice now will determine the fate of this forest, not merely your own." I stumbled out of the lair, back into the cold night air. I was not healed. I was broken. The physical wounds I bore were nothing compared to the mortal injury to my soul. The blood moon was rising, and with it the hour of my final, terrible choice. I found myself alone in the woods, a ghost haunted by a truth more terrible than any phantom. The night before the blood moon was a suffocating shroud. I tried to meditate, to find the quiet center of my being, but my mind was a maelstrom. Ulfgar's words echoed in its chambers, battling with the deeply ingrained hatred for my own nature, a hatred that I now understood to be an artificial construct. The images from the dying wolf's mind, the sorrowful alpha, the sacred altar, superimposed themselves over my own memories of pain and self-loathing. The certainties that had guided me for centuries had been replaced by a dizzying, nauseating void. Who was I, if not the cursed seeker of a cure? What was my purpose, if not this holy war against my own flesh? It was Lena who found me, a small, determined figure emerging from the gloom. Her brother was safe, she said, back in the village, but his mind was a blank slate, a vessel emptied of his recent ordeal. She had seen the society of the werewolves, the families, the children. Her black and white certainty had been shattered as surely as mine. She came not with accusations or pleas, but with a simple, profound offering. In one hand, she carried a salve of herbs to cool the fire in my wounds. In the other, she held a long, heavy blade, an old, silver-inlaid claymore, its blade a full 4 feet of steel that had belonged to her grandfather, a man who had ironically been a famed monster hunter. "I no longer know who is right or wrong in this," she said, her voice steady in the oppressive silence of the forest. "But I know that whatever you do next, the choice must be your own, not theirs." She meant my creators. She meant Ulfgar. She meant the crushing weight of fate. It was a moment of unexpected, piercing clarity. This was our farewell. To allow her to follow me further would be to drag her into my own damnation. I took the sword, its weight both a burden and a comfort. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a flicker of something akin to warmth stirred in the frozen chambers of my heart. I thanked her, and I urged her to take her people and flee, to get as far from the twilight forest as possible before the moon reached its zenith. Whatever was to happen at the source, the innocent should not have to bear witness. She looked at me one last time, a long, searching gaze, and then turned and vanished back into the trees, leaving me once more to my grim pilgrimage. My path to the source was not unopposed. One final guardian stood in my way. He was one of Ulfgar's betas, a massive, grizzled beast who clearly did not agree with his alpha's decision to let me go. He saw me only as a threat, a defiler, an agent of chaos that must be purged. He burst from the shadows, a whirlwind of fanaticism and hate, and attacked without preamble or warning. In his snarling visage, in the pure, undiluted fury of his assault, I saw a perfect mirror. He was the physical embodiment of the blind hatred I had harbored for my own vampiric half for centuries. This was not merely a fight. It was a symbolic confrontation with my own internal demon. The battle was savage. He was all brute strength and righteous rage. But something in me had shifted. I stopped holding back. I stopped compartmentalizing my abilities, drawing on my elven speed to evade and my vampiric strength to counter. For the first time, I did not just use my blood magic as a last resort. I embraced it. I became one with it. My movements were no longer the separate actions of an elf and a vampire, but a seamless, deadly synthesis of both. I moved in a blur of impossible grace and terrifying ferocity, the silver sword a gleaming extension of my will, the crimson tendrils of my own power my shield and secondary weapon. I defeated him. As I stood over his broken form, the life fading from his eyes, I felt no sense of profanity or self-disgust. I felt only complete, whole. And that feeling, that terrifying integration of the light and the dark within me, scared me more than any wound or curse. Ulfgar had been right. The journey to the source was a crucible, forging me into something new. I was no longer seeking a cure. I was walking toward my destiny, to finally meet the creature I was always meant to be. I emerged from the trees onto a great unnatural clearing. The very air here was distorted, shimmering as if with extreme heat, and the grass was a sickly phosphorescent green. In the center of this arena, the source pulsed. It was not a spring of water, but a wound in the earth from which bled a column of viscous liquid light, a silent upward torrent of pure chaotic energy. Hanging directly above like a baleful, bloodshot eye was the moon, swollen and immense, bathing the entire scene in a ghastly crimson radiance. He was waiting for me. Ulfgar. He stood in his war form, a creature of nightmare and legend. He was the size of a grizzly bear, weighing close to 1,000 pounds, a hulking behemoth of muscle and scarred, grizzled fur. But his eyes were not the eyes of a beast. They were ancient, intelligent, and filled with a profound, sorrowful gravity. There were no words. There was nothing left to say. The time for parley and philosophy was over. By a silent, mutual consent that passed between us in a single weighted glance, the ritual began. This was not a battle of good versus evil, of hero against villain. It was a formal, terrible duel between two ancient powers, two custodians of a primordial secret, on a stage set by the cosmos itself. The first phase of the combat was a clash of fundamentals. his impossible strength against my preternatural agility. Ulfgar's attacks were seismic events. He moved with a speed that belied his mass, his claws striking with enough force to shatter stone and fell 30-foot pines. Each blow that missed me sent shock waves through the very ground. I was a phantom, a whisper of motion, weaving between the hammer blows of his assault. My grandfather's silver sword and my own dagger became extensions of my will, flickering in the bloody moonlight, leaving shallow, almost insulting wounds on his massive form. Wounds that healed almost as quickly as I could inflict them. The battle then escalated from the physical to the arcane. Ulfgar, his voice a low growl that was half prayer, half command, called upon the power of the forest. The earth around me groaned in response. Great, woody roots, thick as serpents, erupted from the ground, lashing out to ensnare me. Thorny vines descended from the skeletal branches of the surrounding trees, trying to cage me in a living prison. In response, I unleashed the full, profane power of my vampiric heritage. I threw up shields of shimmering crimson energy, solidified blood that hissed and steamed as the enchanted wood struck them. I hurled bolts of condensed life force, screaming projectiles of raw, stolen vitality that blasted the attacking roots to splinters. The air crackled with the collision of two opposing magics, the green, vital power of the earth against the red, parasitic power of the blood. The forest around us groaned and burned, a casualty of our apocalyptic waltz. The turning point came with a maneuver of desperate, brilliant strategy. Feinting a charge, Ulfgar instead swept a massive paw low, not at me, but at the ground beneath me. The impact was that of a catapult. I was hurled through the air, tumbling end over end, and thrown directly into the pulsing column of the source. The agony was instantaneous and absolute. It was a fire that burned not my flesh, but my very essence. The two warring halves of my soul, the elven and the vampiric, were ignited by the raw, chaotic energy. They began to tear at each other, a civil war at a molecular level. I screamed, a long tearing sound of a soul being rent in two, my body convulsing as it threatened to disintegrate into its constituent warring parts. On that knife's edge of utter annihilation, caught in the crucible of my own nature, I made a choice. It was the choice I had been avoiding for centuries, the one I feared more than death itself. Instead of fighting the darkness within me, instead of trying to purge the vampire to save the elf, I let go. I accepted it. I embraced the monster. I ceased to be Arenvir the elf and Arenvir the vampire. I simply became Arenvir. Under the intense transformative pressure of the source, the two halves of my being did not destroy each other. They fused. They alloyed. I was reborn in that column of agonizing light. I rose from the source, and I was something new. My eyes, once a battleground of blue and red, now burned with a steady, unified violet flame. My strength, my speed, my senses. They had not just been restored. They had been magnified tenfold, integrated into a seamless, perfect whole. I was the weapon my creators had dreamed of, finally complete. In a single fluid motion that was both elven grace and vampiric fury, a blur of impossible speed, I closed the distance between us. Before the ancient Alpha could even react to the horror he had wrought, my claws, now long and black as obsidian, tore through his throat. Ulfgar fell. The sound of his colossal body hitting the phosphorescent grass was a dull, final thud in the sudden ringing silence. The crimson light of the blood moon shone down on the tableau of carnage. its work complete. As I stood over him, panting, the terrible, exhilarating euphoria of my new, integrated power began to recede, leaving behind a cold, hollow emptiness. His great, lupine form shimmered and shrank, collapsing in on itself until the body of the silver-haired, scar-faced man lay at my feet. The forest, which had been a screaming participant in our battle, was now utterly still, as if holding its breath in mourning for its fallen king. He was not yet dead. His ancient eyes, cloudy with the approach of the final darkness, found mine. There was no hatred in them, only a vast cosmic weariness and a flicker of something like pity. You did not destroy the curse," he whispered, his voice a wet, gurgling rasp, blood bubbling at the corners of his lips. "You have absorbed it." He coughed, a racking spasm. "The source, it awakens. It does not heal. Now, you are the guardian. Do not let it wake." With those final cryptic words, the last spark of life faded from his eyes. He was gone. I looked down at my hands, at the obsidian claws that were only now retracting back into my fingertips. I felt the thrumming power within me, a vast, bottomless reservoir of energy. But it was not just my own. I felt the ghost of Ulfgar's strength, the collective life force of the pack that had been tied to their alpha, and I felt it all flowing into me, settling into my soul. And with it came a new and terrible perception. I felt a connection to the forest, a sense of ownership, of responsibility. I was now its master, its warden, and I felt a hunger, but it was not the sharp, familiar pang of vampiric thirst. It was something deeper, older, a hollow ache that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath my feet. And then I heard it, not with my ears, but with my new integrated senses. Deep, deep below the source, in the fathomless dark at the planet's core, something had stirred. A consciousness, vast, ancient, and utterly alien, had shifted in its slumber. Ulfgar's death, my ascension, had weakened the seal. The lock had been broken and reforged, and I was the new key. My curse was not vampirism. My true curse was this: to be the eternal solitary jailer of a sleeping god of chaos. From the distant hamlet, Lena and the others saw the baleful red light over the forest finally fade, replaced by the cold, clean light of the ordinary moon. They did not know what had transpired, only that the howls had ceased and the attacks were over. The legend of the great wolf who stalked the twilight forest died, becoming just another forgotten tale to frighten children. I did not return. There was no place for me in their world, or any world of men or elves. I turned my back on the clearing and walked deeper into the woods, which now bowed to my will, its branches parting before me, its paths clearing at my approach. I felt the weight of my new, terrible purpose settle upon me like a shroud. I was no longer a hunter. I was no longer a victim. I was a sentinel. I was a monster, bound by duty to protect the world from a far greater one. Years bled into decades. New legends began to circulate through the sparse northern settlements. They were not tales of werewolves, but of a silent, spectral king who ruled the twilight forest. A phantom with eyes that burned with a strange, violet fire, who hunted without mercy any who dared venture too close to the forest's unholy heart. They do not know his name. They know only that the forest is forbidden and that the thing it guards must never, ever be set free. I did not find the cure I sought. I found a purpose, and the price for that purpose was an eternity of solitude and a never-ending war against the twin darknesses, the one that slept beneath the earth, and the one that now lived, perfectly and eternally, within me.